On September 25, 2025, a single post on Truth Social sent shockwaves worldwide. In an era where a tweet or a post can move markets and shape destinies, this message was more than just another headline. It was a digital thunderclap that reverberated across continents within minutes. President Donald Trump announced a 100% tariff on all imported branded pharmaceuticals, calling it a strike against the flooding of foreign drugs into the U.S. He framed the move as a bold stand for American patients and manufacturers, vowing to put America's health first and to end what he described as decades of unfair trade practices in the pharmaceutical sector. The abrupt digital decree bypassed traditional channels, instantly upending global markets and alliances. Investors scrambled to assess the fallout as pharmaceutical stocks plummeted and currency markets whipsawed. The world's financial centers, from New York to London to Tokyo, were thrown into a frenzy as analysts tried to make sense of the new reality. For Canada and Australia, the move felt like betrayal. For European and Asian pharma giants, it was a direct assault. Executives in boardrooms across the globe convened emergency meetings, while government officials demanded urgent consultations with Washington. The sense of shock was palpable, as allies questioned whether years of partnership had just been erased with a single post. The world watched as a late-night post threatened to redefine trade and the cost of health in America. Newsrooms buzzed with speculation, and families everywhere wondered what this would mean for the medicines they rely on. The uncertainty was immediate, and the anxiety was global. In Ottawa and Sydney, officials scrambled as stock prices tumbled and supply chains were thrown into chaos. Pharmaceutical warehouses braced for shortages, and health ministers faced tough questions about how to protect their citizens' access to critical drugs. The ripple effects were felt not just in boardrooms, but in hospitals and pharmacies on both sides of the Pacific. The tariff was more than economic policy. It was a geopolitical test, forcing nations to question America's reliability. At emergency summits, world leaders debated their next moves, weighing retaliation against the risk of further escalation. The old rules of global trade seemed to be dissolving before their eyes. This wasn't just about trade deficits. It was about the global supply chain for life-saving medicines. From manufacturing plants in Europe to shipping hubs in Asia, the entire system was suddenly at risk. Pharmacists and doctors worried about shortages, while patients wondered if their next prescription would even be filled. The president's post drew a new line in the sand, daring allies to respond. It was a challenge not just to foreign governments, but to the very fabric of international cooperation. The world was left to wonder, would this be the start of a new era of economic nationalism, or a crisis that forced nations to find common ground? As October approached, the world braced for a trade war not over steel or cars, but over the pills that sustain life. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would shape not just economies, but the health and well-being of millions around the globe. At its core, Trump's plan is a blunt instrument, an aggressive, sweeping policy designed to shake up the pharmaceutical industry in ways not seen in decades. The administration is betting big on a strategy that's as simple as it is dramatic. Use tariffs as a lever to force change, regardless of the disruption it may cause. This is not a nuanced or incremental approach, it's a direct challenge to the status quo, signaling a willingness to upend established global trade relationships in pursuit of domestic manufacturing. The centerpiece is a 100% import tariff, effectively doubling the cost of all branded pharmaceuticals entering the U.S. overnight. For American consumers and businesses, this means that the price of many life-saving medications could skyrocket, putting pressure on both patients and insurers. The administration argues that this pain is necessary to achieve a greater good, rebuilding America's pharmaceutical manufacturing base. The goal is clear. Make foreign drugs so expensive that pharmaceutical companies have no choice but to shift their manufacturing operations to American soil. By making it financially unviable to import, the hope is to create a surge in domestic investment, jobs, and innovation within the U.S. pharmaceutical sector. There's a crucial exemption built into the plan. Any company that is actively building a U.S. plant can avoid the tariff. This has triggered a frantic race among global pharmaceutical giants to announce new construction projects, break ground on American factories, and secure their place in the U.S. market before the deadline hits. In 2023, the U.S. imported $158 billion in pharmaceuticals, accounting for over 5% of total imports. The bulk of these drugs come from countries like Ireland, Germany, Switzerland, and Canada, nations with robust pharmaceutical industries and deep trade ties to the U.S. These relationships are now under intense strain as companies and governments scramble to respond. The tariff specifically targets branded drugs, leaving generics mostly untouched for now. However, the global nature of pharmaceutical supply chains means that even generic drugs could see ripple effects, higher costs for ingredients, delays in production, and uncertainty for patients who rely on affordable medication. This move didn't come out of nowhere. It's the culmination of months of escalating protectionist rhetoric, trade threats, and policy maneuvers. The administration has been signaling its intentions, but now, with this announcement, the ambiguity is gone. The threat is real, and the consequences are immediate. The clock is ticking. Companies, investors, and patients alike are now facing an imminent deadline, with little time to prepare for the sweeping changes ahead. The sense of urgency is palpable across the industry. By targeting such a personal and essential sector, the administration is making a calculated bet that the promise of new American jobs and greater self-sufficiency will outweigh the risk of higher prices, potential shortages, and backlash from both the public and international partners. The policy is both carrot and stick, rewarding those who invest in American manufacturing while punishing those who continue to rely on foreign supply chains. It's a high-stakes gamble with far-reaching implications for the industry and for millions of Americans who depend on these medications. The pharmaceutical world is left scrambling to adapt. Executives are holding emergency meetings, supply chain managers are reworking logistics, and scientists are racing to ensure that research and production can continue without major disruption. The administration's message is unmistakable. Invest in America, or pay the price. The hope is to spark a renaissance in domestic drug manufacturing, but the risks of price spikes, shortages, and international retaliation are impossible to ignore. The stakes are high, and the fallout is already being felt. Markets are reacting, companies are making tough decisions, and the world is watching to see how this bold experiment will play out. The countdown to October 1st has begun, and the next few months will determine the future of America's pharmaceutical landscape. The tariff announcement split America instantly, sending shockwaves through living rooms, boardrooms, and hospital corridors across the country. The news dominated every screen, sparking heated conversations and anxious glances as people tried to grasp what it would mean for their families, their jobs, and their health. Supporters called it a bold move to reclaim control over a vital industry, promising jobs and security. They argued that bringing pharmaceutical manufacturing back to American soil would not only create employment, but also protect the nation from future global supply shocks. For many, it was a patriotic stand, an assertion of American strength and self-reliance. Critics, including Democrats and free trade Republicans, warned it was a reckless tax on the sick, predicting soaring prices and drug shortages. Healthcare professionals voiced fears that patients would be forced to choose between medicine and other essentials, while some lawmakers cautioned that the policy could backfire, hurting the very people it aimed to help. Economists sounded alarms about inflation and supply disruptions. They pointed to the risk of higher costs rippling through the entire healthcare system, warning that the move could destabilize markets and undermine economic recovery. The pharmaceutical lobby and Chamber of Commerce condemned the move as impractical and dangerous. Industry leaders argued that the tariffs would stifle innovation, disrupt research, and ultimately harm patients by making life-saving drugs harder to access. Media coverage reflected the divide. Some hailed a fight for American workers, others spotlighted patients fearing unaffordable prescriptions. Talk shows, op-eds, and social media feeds buzzed with passionate arguments on both sides, amplifying the sense of national uncertainty. Patient advocacy groups and hospitals warned of impossible choices and budget crises. They pleaded for policymakers to consider the real-world impact on vulnerable patients, especially those with chronic illnesses or limited incomes. The debate cut to the core of American healthcare, industrial independence versus immediate pain for patients. It forced the nation to confront difficult questions about values, priorities, and the true meaning of security. Uncertainty reigned as the nation weighed the cost of economic sovereignty. For many, the future felt more unpredictable than ever, with no easy answers in sight. The question, what price is America willing to pay for control? As the debate raged on, Americans everywhere were left to wonder how this bold gamble would shape their lives, their health, and the country's future. For Canada, the tariff was a direct threat to a deeply integrated partnership. Canadian officials condemned the move, warning it would harm patients and disrupt cross-border supply chains. Many drugs crossed the border multiple times during production. A 100% tariff could shatter this ecosystem. The unilateral announcement eroded trust, with Canada vowing retaliatory tariffs if the policy wasn't reversed. Ottawa framed its stance as defense, not aggression, highlighting shared risks and appealing to American consumers. The message breaking North American trade bonds would hurt both nations. Canada's warning was clear. Once trust is broken, it's hard to repair. The US-Canada relationship now faced its toughest test in decades. Australia's response was measured but wary. As a key US ally and pharma exporter, Australia felt the shock in its markets. CSL's stock plunged. Behind closed doors, officials saw the tariff as a negotiating bluff, not a final policy. Rather than retaliate, Australia called for dialogue, emphasizing alliance and shared security. Yet, analysts warned even a bluff could fracture alliances and destabilize the Indo-Pacific. The move was seen as unpredictable, risking long-term trust. Australia walked a tightrope, projecting calm, but acknowledging real economic and strategic risks. The hope was that reason would prevail before the bluff became reality. The tariff tested the resilience of the US-Australia partnership. Canberra waited, watching for Washington's next move. The tariff announcement sent shockwaves through global markets, hitting pharma stocks hardest. European giants like Novartis and Roche, and Japanese firms like Sumitomo, saw shares tumble. India's pharma index dropped as investors braced for export losses. The market's verdict was clear: the policy threatened to upend decades of trade. Multinational firms scrambled to assess supply chains and investment plans. Corporate statements mixed diplomacy with warnings about medicine shortages. Companies highlighted U.S. investments, hoping for exemptions. The message to policymakers: this tariff could disrupt the global flow of life-saving drugs. Across Europe and Asia, governments sprang into action. The EU demanded urgent talks, citing trade agreements meant to cap tariffs. The UK, fresh off a new US trade deal, saw its pharma giants' US investments as a possible shield. In Asia, Japan and South Korea worried about alliance strains, while India faced threats to its export economy. The tariff forced countries to rethink reliance on the U.S. and consider diversifying trade. Diplomacy intensified as nations weighed confrontation, negotiation, or adaptation. The world now faced a new, unpredictable American trade policy. The question: could diplomacy de-escalate, or was a new era of conflict beginning? The global order was suddenly in flux. Economists warned the tariff would mean higher drug prices for Americans. Doubling import costs would ripple through wholesalers, hospitals, and insurers, ultimately hitting consumers. The risk of drug shortages loomed, as domestic production can't ramp up overnight. The pharmaceutical lobby argued the tariff would divert billions from research and slow innovation. Instead of new cures, companies would pay duties. The policy's immediate pain, higher prices, possible shortages, clashed with the long-term goal of onshoring jobs. The debate: is future industrial strength worth present suffering for patients? The transition, experts warned, would be rocky and uncertain. The pharmaceutical tariff has already reshaped global trade and trust. For decades, the U.S. was a stable anchor. Now, allies must hedge their bets. The message: no relationship guarantees protection from America's domestic agenda. Nations are diversifying partnerships, building new blocs, and reducing U.S. dependence. Corporations now see America as a riskier place to invest. The move undermines U.S. leadership and credibility on the world stage. The deeper question: has rules-based trade given way to economic nationalism? The world is watching to see if this is a new era, or just a passing storm. The answer will shape the global order for years to come.